Hungary is now in a position to respond even if the agreement between the EU and Turkey doesn't work, and we're able to stop the wave of immigration on the Serb-Hungarian border.
We've been taking an in-depth look at Hungary this week, and we began our coverage with a discussion about the country's handling of refugees. With thousands of people stranded on Hungary's border with Serbia, the Prime Minister came up with a solution: build a new wall to keep them out. Our reporter in Budapest found there's strong support for these anti-immigrant policies, with one refugee advocate saying there's no asylum anymore in Hungary. On Monday, we spoke to human rights organizations, including the UNHCR, who said Hungary is breaking international law. Now it's the government's turn to have its say. Joining me from Budapest is Zoltán Kovács. He's the Hungarian government spokesman and works out of the Prime Minister's office. Thank you very much for joining us. A pleasure having you on the program. So far this year, there's been a trickle of asylum seekers coming through, yet you have another fence. Tell me why you need it.
Well, if you take a look back for the past year and a half, we've been improving our capabilities to ensure the borders of the European Union, that is the Schengen borders, and that is ensure that, as it's required, that no illegal migrants can step on Hungary's and therefore the European Union soil. So we are basically improving our capability to separate genuine refugees from illegal migrants, economic migrants, and also our capability to ensure that everybody who would like to come to the European Union keeps the existing regulations and law.
Now, this double barrier stretches for 155 kilometers. It comes with alarms, thermal imaging cameras, and then you have these migrants and refugees essentially detained in shipping containers. Internationally, is that the kind of image that you're comfortable with for your country?
Well, we'd like to remind you that even your country is building a large wall at its southern frontiers, ensuring that no illegal migrants can enter the territory of Turkey. And keep in mind that back in Calais last year, when they ensured that people are not going to live anymore in tents and in makeshifts, but rather in containers, that was a huge improvement. We are providing everything in those containers and asylums that is required by international law at the level and at the standard that is, again, required by international law.
UNHCR are unhappy. They told us you're committing human rights abuses against vulnerable people and you're breaking international law. Do you care?
We've seen those complaints for the past year and a half, 2 years. Keep in mind that so far, though we have our debates with the European Union, nobody was able to prove that we are violating any of the rules. As a matter of fact, Hungary is the only country so far who is keeping all the rules, all the existing rules for the European Union.
Catherine Woolard, she's the Secretary General of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. I spoke to her. I asked her what her message would be for you because I told her I'd be speaking to you later in the week. Here's what she had to say. Have a listen.
You could ask them why they feel so threatened by the arrival of a group of vulnerable people who need international protection. It would also be interesting, on your last point, to ask why they've put forward a law which will restrict the operations of civil society. We're very concerned about this.
So 2 points there from Catherine Woolard. I hope you heard her clearly. Your chance to respond, sir?
I heard it clearly, and there's nothing new in the complaints or in the points she made. The European Union is in no possession yet of the capability to separate genuine refugees from economic migrants, illegal migrants. As a matter of fact, all who arrive at the borders of the European Union today are illegal migrants by definition. The capability to determine whether they are entitled for refugee status is limited, and our experience that when it's done within the European Union, it's problematic. Most of them are going to be turned down, the claims that they are going for political asylum. We see Germany and the Scandinavian countries struggling with the problem how to send people back where they were coming from. So the Hungarian perception is keep everyone who is coming illegally beyond the borders until we are able to determine whether they are entitled for protection or they are not. That's point number one. The second point, I don't believe that the transparency of so-called NGOs has anything to do with the migrant crisis in terms of or connect the two things legally. However, politically, they should be connected because we've seen many NGOs claiming to be civil, representing civil opinion and push, operate at the edge of legality, basically inciting migration, helping illegal migrants to enter the European Union. And in that, we believe there's a need for transparency to see whose money is working behind that. It's clearly a political agenda in which we differ.
Yeah, as you say, so, okay, legally we can separate them out, but politically maybe we put this together, and the way they define you is they see it politically as the same policy, so they see a sort of ever-shrinking sense of freedom in the country. So they're saying you don't want migrants, you're making it harder for people to come in, you're pushing a bigger nationalism, you're pushing hard against these civil society organizations and NGOs and, calling them, quote, representing the interests of illegal migrants against those of Hungary, going after liberal universities. So they look at it as a political atmosphere, right? And that's why it's not just them, but also the tens of thousands that we saw in Budapest marching and protesting against this. They see this as a general trend amongst this government. What do you think?
Well, it's possible to raise false standards to measure freedom. I don't want to cope with those issues because we've seen these compliments or other complaints and accusations coming to the government for the past 6 years. That's a political statement I don't want to deal with, because the first responsibility of a responsible and elected government like yours in Turkey to ensure the security of its own people. And on that, we are uncompromising.
What you're doing right now, is all of this essentially an insurance policy in case the EU-Turkey deal completely collapses?
We strongly believe that cooperation with Turkey is essential. But we've been outspoken on another aspect of this phenomenon we have to deal with, and that is illegal migration, that we shall also rely on ourselves. So it's impossible that we rely on someone else, actually, when we are talking about our own security. So it's like in the case of Turkey, who is doing everything for its own security, for its own legal standards. It's a must on behalf of the European Union to ensure that something like that exists. And so far, nobody was able to suggest a better solution to stop illegal migration than what we use at the borders of Hungary, and that is a fence, reinforced legal environment, and lots of personnel on the ground.
In 2015, Prime Minister Orban made civilizational and religious references to why Hungary is going to be tough against migration. Was that regrettable?
No, I think the Hungarian position on that is fairly consistent. We don't believe it's a religious issue. It's, first of all, again, a matter of security. It's a huge security risk to let people into the European Union without any kind of security screening and keeping the existing European protocols and frameworks. Keep in mind that back in 2015, we have seen over 400,000 people coming through Hungary to the heart of Europe without our consent, without papers, without following any of the rules. And that's impossible to be repeated. That's why we have erected all these measures on the border.
You say we don't believe it's religious, but let me quote the Prime Minister to you. You know his views better than I do, but let me quote him. We shouldn't forget that the people who are coming here grew up in a different religion and represent a completely different culture. Most are not Christian, but Muslim. This was in a German newspaper in 2015. Europe and European culture have Christian roots. I think we have a right to decide that we do not want a large number of Muslim people in our country. We do not like the consequences of having a large number of Muslim communities that we see in other countries. He went on, there's a lot there, but he ended it with, that is a historical experience for us. So basically, he's telling ordinary Hungarians you're going to have another kind of Ottoman invasion. I ask you again, is that regrettable?
No, it's not. You don't have to go to Germany to see that in the newspapers. You can see it on the government's website. I think the Prime Minister has always been very outspoken and frank when talking about this issue. We would like to avoid those mistakes you can see in the western part of Europe, and that is the existence of parallel societies. And we represent the Hungarian people's interest, and that has nothing to do with our belief that the peaceful coexistence of religions is a reality, and that's what we are looking forward.
But he's mentioned Muslims specifically, and he said that is a historical experience for us. What do you think he meant by that?
well, it's a historical experience for us in Western Europe for the past couple of decades. And don't forget that we have a quite long, almost 200 years experience living next to a Muslim country, a Muslim empire back a couple of centuries ago. And that is, again, a historical legacy, a historical experience we carry on.
Mm-hmm. And talking about historical experience, would you accept that for many refugees and asylum seekers, looking at your country, under Nazi occupation, many people fled and were allowed to flee to other countries. Under Soviet occupation, many people fled and were allowed to flee to other countries. They made it out of Hungary. Other countries welcomed them in. Can't you see a parallel maybe with people fleeing Syria?
No, we can't.
Tell me why.
Well, in this part of the world, this kind of comparison would testify about a complete lack of historical knowledge and a distorted historical perspective on what is happening in the world. What we see in the Near East, affecting Turkey, basically all the Balkan countries, Hungary and the entire European Union, is not a refugee crisis. We've been through this conversation and these claims for the past 2 years. What we see is a massive global migration crisis in which it is impossible that Europe is taking all the responsibility for the suffering around the globe.
Mm-hmm. And my final question to you, and once again, granting you the fact that you can look after your borders however you want to, you're a sovereign state, does Hungary keep itself open to legitimate asylum seekers as they define it? Are you open to people you consider legitimate refugees and asylum seekers?
Absolutely, and that's been the case for the past, not only 2 years, but for the past decade. Hungary has been always accepting legal migrants, and that is those who were trying to come to Hungary, applied for asylum, and waited until they were granted that asylum. Our experience for the past 2 years, unfortunately, was very different. 95% of those who came to Hungary and at least applied for asylum has basically disappeared right immediately after applying for that. That's the name of illegal migration today at the borders of the European Union. Migrants are misusing the existing legal framework. So Hungary has always been up to its word, up to the legal and international standards. We are taking migrants, we are taking genuine refugees by a couple of hundreds every year, but only those who wanted to stay here and who go through the required security screening and the required international protocol.
Zoltán Kovács, sir, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.